The same minute as the U.S. president's 10% global tariffs expired overnight, this new forced labor duty came into effect, and it is already sparking global backlash.
We're not in favor of sweatshops.
U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has outlined his rationale for hitting Canada with a new 10% levy on non-free trade compliant goods.
One of the new provisions we forced Canada and Mexico to take was their own prohibition on forced labor. We're finding that they aren't actually enforcing that.
But the Canadian government rejects that claim.
We don't agree with the Section 301 tariffs, and we have some of the strongest provisions around forced labor.
Other global leaders also pushing back.
The argumentation behind that it's forced labor, sorry, but you can't say that for European Union.
This imposition of higher tariffs on Australia is completely unjustified.
China, which has been criticized over using ethnic minority Uyghurs' forced labor, also hit by the new duty. But the Chinese government not pledging to make any labor changes, only saying trade wars are not in anyone's interest.
Canada has made a bold move against Trump's tariff push, and it is changing the entire story. Instead of putting Canada under pressure, this decision is making Canada look stronger, while raising serious questions about the United States. The real damage may not be to Canada, but to the United States. United States' 10% global tariff expired, and within the same 24 hours, Washington replaced it with a new 10% duty targeting goods allegedly tied to forced labor. Canada was named. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer accused Canada of failing to enforce provisions keeping forced labor goods out of supply chains. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, rejected the claim outright. Canada, he argued, already maintains some of the strongest anti-forced labor protections in the world, and the international response made clear Canada was far from alone. The tariff Greer announced on July 2026 was imposed under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. And the choice of that specific legal authority is the detail that explains the entire move. In February 2026, the US Supreme Court struck down Trump's earlier reciprocal tariffs, which had been imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That ruling dismantled the legal basis for much of Trump's global tariff structure. Section 301 is different. It has survived prior court challenges. By grounding the new forced labor tariffs in Section 301, the administration is rebuilding its tariff wall on a legal foundation more resistant to the judicial challenges that toppled its predecessor. Greer defended the measure in human rights terms. His argument was that Canada and dozens of other nations had failed to adequately enforce provisions preventing forced labor from entering supply chains, provisions he characterized as requirements under updated North American trade terms. The framing positions the tariff not as a trade deficit measure, which the Supreme Court rejected, but as a labor standards enforcement action which sits on firmer legal ground and carries a moral justification that pure trade balance arguments lack. Canada's rejection of that justification was delivered by Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and rests on a specific factual claim. Canada already has some of the strongest anti-forced labor laws in the world. Canada prohibits the importation of goods produced through forced labor under its customs legislation. Ottawa recently introduced legislation that would require importers to prove their supply chains are free of forced labor, a due diligence standard that would place Canada among the more rigorous enforcement regimes internationally. LeBlanc's position is that the American accusation of inadequate enforcement is not supported by the actual state of Canadian law. There is, however, a documented complication in Canada's position that former diplomats and trade experts have raised. While Canada has strong anti-forced labor laws on the books, internal tracking units responsible for enforcement were previously scaled back. And the new legislation requiring importers to prove clean supply chains does not yet have a confirmed timeline to become law. That gap between the strength of Canada's legal framework and the operational capacity to enforce it is the specific vulnerability the American accusation targets. Canada's response is that its legal protections are among the world's strongest. The counterargument is that strong laws without fully resourced enforcement units are not the same as effective enforcement in practice. The international pushback against the forced labor rationale extended far beyond Canada and undermined the American justification through comparison. European Commission Vice President Kaja Kallas said the forced labor argument cannot be applied to the EU, comparing European labor standards to American ones, and noting the bloc's paid vacations and strong labor conditions. She described the rationale for the levy on the EU as not grounded. New Zealand's Prime Minister said the American investigation did not provide meaningful evidence to support the forced labor claims. Australia, Brazil, and China all condemned the rationale as unjustified. When multiple developed democracies with labor standards comparable to or exceeding American standards are simultaneously accused of enabling forced labor, the accusation's credibility as a targeted human rights measure weakens. The forced labor tariff is one of two distinct American tariff actions Canada faced within a single week. On July 20th, Trump signed proclamations imposing 50% tariffs on a broad range of Canadian goods: wine, dairy, cement, furniture, and hockey equipment, targeting an estimated $28 billion in Canadian exports and taking effect August 19th. Those measures cited trade discrimination in the automotive, alcohol, and dairy sectors. The July 24th forced labor tariff operates under separate legal authority on a separate timeline with a separate justification. Canada is now managing two simultaneous tariff actions, each demanding its own legal and diplomatic response. The wildfire smoke dispute adds a third front to the tensions between Washington and Ottawa. Trump posted on Truth Social on July 17th, accusing Canada of willful negligence in forest management and threatening to add wildfire, smoke, pollution costs to existing tariffs. Ontario had 191 active wildfires burning at the time. That dispute, legally separate from both the forced labor and the 50% trade tariffs, reflects the pattern of the Trump administration attaching tariff threats to an expanding range of grievances, from trade discrimination to labor standards to environmental smoke. Canada's negotiating posture following the forced labor tariff remains consistent with its response to the broader trade conflict. Prime Minister Mark Carney has stated Canada remains open to talks while maintaining that it will defend its economy, workers, and businesses. His phrase from July 23rd, "Everything is on the table," describes the government's readiness to respond across all available options. The intensified negotiations Carney and Trump agreed to on July 21st are the primary track through which Canada is pursuing resolution before the August 19th deadline on the 50% tariffs. The diversification strategy running parallel to the negotiations continues, regardless of the forced labor measure. Canada has signed more than 20 new economic and security partnerships since March. 2025 built new Pacific export infrastructure through the Trans Mountain expansion and LNG Canada, and secured defense contracts with Germany, Australia, and the UK, Japan, Italy consortium. Each reduces the leverage any single trading partner holds over the Canadian economy, the structural response to a tariff environment that now spans trade discrimination, national security, forced labor, and threatened environmental measures across 4 separate legal authorities. Canada sends approximately 70% of its exports to the United States. The bilateral relationship was worth more than $900 billion in 2024, before Trump's second term. USTR Greer stated in May 2026 that Canada was the only country apart from China to have retaliated against American tariffs. The forced labor tariff adds a new dimension to that 18-month conflict, one where Canada's defense rests not on disputing the principle behind the measure, but on the documented strength of the anti-forced labor protections it maintains, and on the international consensus that the rationale Washington offered does not withstand comparison with the labor standards of the countries it targeted.